Chapter 2, To Kill a Mockingbird, Reader's Digest version. The remainder of my school days were no more auspicious than the first. Indeed, they were an endless project that slowly evolved into a unit in which miles of construction paper and wax crayon were expended by the state of Alabama in its well-meaning but fruitless efforts to teach me group dynamics. As I inched sluggishly along the treadmill of the Macomb County school system, I could not help receiving the impression that I was being cheated out of something. I could not believe that 12 years of unrelieved boredom was exactly what the state had in mind for me. Released from school every day 30 minutes before gym, I ran by the Radley place as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the safety of our front porch. One afternoon, as I raced by, something caught my eye. I took a deep breath, a long look around, and went back. 2 live oaks stood at the edge of the Radley lot. Their roots reached out into the side road and made it bumpy. In one of the trees, some tinfoil was sticking in a knothole just above my eye level, winking at me in the sun. I stood on tiptoe, reached into the hole, and withdrew 2 pieces of chewing gum, minus their outer wrappers. I ran home and examined my loot. The gum looked fresh. I sniffed it, and it smelled all right. I licked it and waited a while. When I did not die, I crammed it into my mouth. Wrigley's Double Mint. When Jim came home, he asked me where I got such a wad. I told him I found it. Don't eat things you find, Scout. This wasn't on the ground. It was in that tree yonder. Spit it out right now. I spat it out. The tang was fading anyway. I've been chewing it all afternoon and I ain't dead yet, not even sick. Jim stamped his foot. Don't you know you're not supposed to even touch the trees over there? You'll get killed if you do. You go gargle. Right now, you hear? You don't, and I'll tell Calpurnia on you. Rather than risk a tangle with Cal, I did as Jim said. For some reason, my first year of school had wrought a great change in our relationship. Calpurnia's tyranny had faded to a gentle grumbling. On my part, I went to much trouble, sometimes, not to provoke her. Summer was on the way. Jim and I awaited it with impatience. Summer was our best season. It was sleeping on the back-screened porch and cots. It was everything good to eat. It was 1,000 colors in a parched landscape. But most of all, summer was dill. The authorities released us early the last day of school, and Jim and I walked home together. Reckon old Dill will be coming tomorrow, I said. Probably day after, said Jim. Mississippi turns him loose a day later. As we came to the live oaks at the Radley place, I raised my finger to point for the 100th time to the knothole where I had found the gum, and found myself pointing at another piece of tinfoil. I see it, Scout. Jim looked around, reached up, and gingerly pocketed a tiny, shiny package. We ran home, and on the front porch we looked at a small box patchworked with bits of tinfoil from chewing gum wrappers. It was the kind of box rings come in, purple velvet with a minute catch. Inside were 2 scrubbed and polished pennies. Indian heads, Jim said. 1906 and 1900. Scout, these are real old. Say, Jim, you reckon that's somebody's hiding place? Nah, don't know anybody much but us pass by here. Cecil goes by the back street and all the way around town to get home. Cecil Jacobs, who lived at the far end of our street, walked a total of 1 mile per school day to avoid the Radley place. You reckon we ought to keep 'em, Jim? Tell you what, said Jim, we'll keep 'em till school starts, then ask everybody if they're theirs. There's some bus child's, maybe. See how they've been slicked up? These are important to somebody. Indian heads, well, they come from the Indians. They're good luck, real strong magic. I'm going to put them in my trunk. Jim stopped and looked for a long time at the Radley place before he went to his room. He seemed to be thinking again. 2 days later, Dill arrived in a blaze of glory. He had ridden the train by himself from Meridian to Macomb Junction. He had eaten dinner on the train. He had seen two twins hitched together get off the train in Bay St. Louis and stuck to his story regardless of threats. He wore real short pants now with a belt, and he said he had seen his father. Dill's father was taller than ours. He had a black beard, pointed, and he was president of the L&N Railroad. I helped the engineer for a while, said Dill, yawning. In a pig's ear you did, said Jim. What do we play today? We strolled to the front yard where Dill stood looking at the Radley place. I smell death, he said. When I told him to shut up, he said, I mean it. I can smell somebody and tell if they're going to die. An old lady taught me how. Dill leaned over and sniffed me. Jean Louise Finch, you are going to die in 3 days. Y'all hush, growled Jim. You act like you believe in hot steams. What's a hot steam? Asked Dill. Ever walk along a lonesome road at night and pass by a hot place? A hot steam's somebody who can't get to heaven, just wallows around on lonesome roads, and if you walk through him, when you die, you'll be one too, and go around at night sucking people's breath. If you have to go through one, you say, Angel bright, life and death, get off the road, don't suck my breath. Calpurnia says that's silly, I said. Jim scowled darkly at me. Well, what'll we play? Let's roll in the tire, I suggested. I ran and pulled an old car tire from under the house. I'm first. Dill said he ought to be first. He just got here. Jim arbitrated, awarded me with first push with an extra time for Dill, and I folded myself inside the tire. Until it happened, I did not realize that Jim was offended by my contradicting him on hot steams. He rewarded me now by pushing the tire down the sidewalk with all the force in his body. Ground, sky, and houses melted into a mad pallet. My ears throbbed. I could not put out my hands to stop. They were wedged between my chest and my knees. The tire skittered across the road, crashed into a barrier, and popped me like a cork onto the pavement. Dizzy and nauseated, I raised my head and stared at the Radley Place steps in front of me. I froze. Jim was screaming, Scout, don't just lie there. Get up, can't you? I got to my feet, trembling. Bring the tire, Jim hollered. When I was able to navigate, I ran back to them as fast as my shaking knees would carry me. Why didn't you bring the tire? Jim yelled. Why don't you get it? I screamed. Jim looked at me furiously, ran down the sidewalk, treaded water at the Radley gate, then dashed in and retrieved the tire. See there, Jim scowled triumphantly. Nothing to it. I swear, Scout, sometimes you act so much like a girl, it's mortifying. Calpurnia appeared in the front door and yelled, Lemonade time! Lemonade in the middle of the morning was a summertime ritual. Calpurnia set a pitcher and 3 glasses on the porch. Jim gulped down his glassful and slapped his chest. I know what we are going to play, he announced. Something different. What? Asked Dill. Boo Radley. Jim at times was transparent. He had thought that up to contrast his own fearless heroism with my cowardice. Scout, he said, you can be Mrs. Radley. I declare if I will, Jim, he can get out at night when we're all asleep. How's he going to know what we're doing? Jim said. Besides, I don't think he's still there. He died years ago and they stuffed him up the chimney. Jim parceled out our roles. I was Mrs. Radley, and all I had to do was come out and sweep the porch. Dill was old Mr. Radley. He walked up and down the sidewalk and coughed when Jim spoke to him. Jim, naturally, was Boo. He went under the front steps and shrieked and howled from time to time. As the summer progressed, so did our game. We added dialogue and plot until we had manufactured a small play, upon which we rained changes every day. It was a melancholy little drama, woven from bits and scraps of neighborhood legend. Mrs. Radley had been beautiful until she married Mr. Radley and lost all her money. She also lost most of her teeth, her hair, and her right forefinger. Dill's contribution. Boo bit it off when he couldn't find any squirrels to eat. She sat in the living room and cried most of the time, while Boo slowly whittled away all the furniture in the house. When it was time for Boo's big scene, Jim would sneak the sewing scissors out of the house, then sit in the swing and cut up newspapers. Dill would walk by, cough at Jim, and Jim would fake a plunge into Dill's thigh. Our activities halted when any of the neighbors appeared. But one day we were so busy playing that we did not see Atticus standing on the sidewalk. "What are you all playing?" he asked. "Nothing," said Jim. "Does this by any chance have to do with the Radleys?" "No, sir," said Jim, reddening. "I hope it doesn't," Atticus said shortly, and then went into the house. "Jim," I said, "I think Atticus knows." "No, he don't. If he did, he'd say he did." Jim added that I was being a girl, that girls always imagined things. That's why other people hated them so. And if I started behaving like one, I could just go off and find some to play with. "All right, just keep it up then," I said. "You'll find out." Atticus, Atticus's arrival was the second reason I wanted to quit the game. The first reason happened the day I rolled into the Radley yard. Through all the head shaking and Jim yelling, I had heard another sound, so low I could not have heard it from the sidewalk. Someone inside the house was laughing. To my relief, we slowed down the game for a while, with Dill in hearty agreement. Dill was becoming something of a trial now, following Jim about. He had asked me earlier in the summer to marry him, then he promptly forgot about it. He staked me out, marked me as his property, then he neglected me. I beat him up twice, but it did no good. He only grew closer to Jim. They spent days together in the treehouse plotting, calling me only when they needed a third party. On pain of being called a girl, I spent most of the remaining twilights that summer sitting with Miss Maudie Atkinson on her front porch, just across the street. Miss Maudie was a widow. She worked in her flower beds in an old straw hat and men's coveralls. But after her 5 o'clock bath, she would appear on the porch and reign over the street in magisterial beauty. She loved everything that grew in God's earth, even the weeds, with one exception. If she found a blade of nutgrass in her yard, it was like the second battle of the Marne. She swooped down upon it with a tin tub and subjected it to blast with a poisonous substance she said was so powerful it'd kill us all if we didn't stand out of the way. Miss Maudie made the best cakes in the neighborhood. Every time she baked, she made a big cake and 3 little ones, and she would call across the street, "Jim Finch, Scout Finch, Charles Baker Harris, come here." Our promptness was always rewarded. In summertime, twilights are long and peaceful. Often Miss Maudie and I would sit silently on her porch, watching the sky go from yellow to pink, while flights of martins swept low over the neighborhood. "Miss Maudie," I said one evening, "do you think Boo Radley's still alive?" "His name's Arthur, and he's alive," she said. "Do you smell my mimosa? It's like angel's breath this evening." "Yes'm." "How do you know that Mr. Arthur's still alive?" "I know he's alive, Jean Louise, because I haven't seen him carried out yet. Arthur Radley just stays in the house, that's all. Wouldn't you stay in the house if you didn't want to come out?" "Yes'm, but I'd want to come out. Miss Maudie, do you believe all those things they say about Mr. Arthur?" "What things?" I told her. "That is 3/4 color talk and 1/4 Stephanie Crawford," said Miss Maudie grimly. "Stephanie Crawford even told me once she woke up in the night and found him looking in the window at her. I said, 'What did you do, Stephanie? Move over in the bed and make room for him?' That shut her up." "I was sure it did." "No, child," Miss Maudie said. "That is a sad house. I remember Arthur Radley when he was a boy. He always spoke to me as nicely as he knew how, no matter what folks said." "You reckon he's crazy?" "If he's not, he should be by now. What happens in houses behind closed doors? What secrets? Miss Maudie shook her head. But not your father. Atticus Finch is the same in his house as he is on the public streets. Child, how'd you like some fresh pound cake to take home? I liked it very much. Next morning, I found Jim and Dill in the backyard, deep in conversation. As usual, they said, go away. Will not. This yard's as much mine as yours, Jim Finch. If you stay, you've got to do what we tell you, Jim warned. All right, what is it? Jim said placidly. We are going to give a note to Boo Radley. Just how? Automatic terror rose in me. Jim was going to put a note on the end of a fishing pole and stick it through a loose shutter he had noticed on the side of the house. If anyone came along, Dill would ring the bell. He raised his right hand. In it was my mother's silver dinner bell. You'll watch the back end of the lot, Jim went on. Dill's going to watch the front, and if anybody comes, he'll ring the bell. That clear? All right, then. What'd you write him? Dill said, We're asking him real politely to come out and tell us what he does in there. We said we wouldn't hurt him, and we'd buy him an ice cream. I figure if he'd come out and sit a spell with us, he might feel better. How'd you feel if you'd been shut up for 100 years with nothing but cats to eat? I bet he's got a beard down to here. Like your daddy's? He ain't got a beard. Dill stopped as if trying to remember. Uh-huh. Gotcha. I said, you said he had a black beard. If it's all the same to you, he shaved it off last summer. You all hush, said Jim. He scuttled beneath the house and came out with a yellow bamboo pole. Reckon this is long enough to reach from the sidewalk? Anybody who's brave enough to go up and touch the house had not to use a fishing pole, I said. This is different, said Jim. Dill took a piece of paper from his pocket and gave it to Jim, and the three of us walked cautiously toward the old house. Dill remained at the light pole in the corner of the lot, and Jim and I edged down the sidewalk parallel to the side of the house. I walked where I could see around the curve. All clear, I said. Jim attached the note to the end of the fishing pole and pushed it toward the window he had selected. The pole lacked several inches of being long enough, and Jim leaned over the fence as far as he could. I watched him make jabbing motions, trying to place the note on the windowsill. It would flutter to the ground, and Jim would jab it up, until I thought if Boo Radley ever received it, he wouldn't be able to read it. I was turning to look down the street again when the dinner bell rang. Shoulder up, I reeled around to face Boo Radley and his bloody fangs. Instead, I saw Dill ringing the bell with all his might in Atticus's face. Jim looked so awful I didn't have the heart to tell him I told him so. Atticus said, Stop ringing that bell. In the silence that followed, he pushed his hat to the back of his head and put his hands on his hips. Jim, he said, what were you doing? Nothing, sir. I don't want any of that. Tell me. We were just trying to give a letter to Mr. Radley. Let me see it. Jim held out a filthy piece of paper. Atticus tried to read it. Why do you want Mr. Radley to come out? Dill said, We thought he might enjoy us, and dried up when Atticus looked at him. Son, he said to Jim, I'm going to tell you just one time. Stop tormenting that man. If Mr. Radley wanted to stay inside his own house, he had the right to stay there, free from the intentions of inquisitive children. We were to stay away from the Radley house until we were invited there. And furthermore, we were not to play an asinine game he had seen us playing or make fun of anybody in this town. We weren't making fun of him, said Jim. We were just... So that was what you were doing in that game. Making fun of him? No, said Atticus, putting his life's history on display for the edification of the neighborhood. Jim seemed to swell. I didn't say we were doing that. Atticus grinned dryly. You just told me, he said. You stop this nonsense right now, every one of you. Jim gaped. and was silent. When Atticus went inside the house, Jim finally realized that he had been done in by the oldest lawyer's trick on record. Yes, said our father, when Jim asked if we could go sit by Miss Rachel's fish pool with Dill, as this was his last night in Maycomb. Tell him so long for me, and we'll see him next summer. We leaped over the low wall that separated Miss Rachel's yard from our driveway. Jim whistled Bob White, and Dill answered in the darkness. Look yonder, said Jim. He pointed to the east. A gigantic moon was rising behind Miss Maudie's pecan trees. Dill said altogether too casually, Let's go for a walk. He sounded fishy to me. Nobody in Maycomb just went for a walk. Where to? Dill jerked his head in a southerly direction. Jim said, Okay. When I protested, he said, Scout, we ain't going to do anything. We're just going to the street light and back. We strolled silently down the sidewalk, listening to porch swings creaking with the weight of the neighborhood, listening to the soft night murmurs of the grown people. Well, said Dill. Okay, said Jim. Why don't you go on home, Scout? What are you gonna do? Dill and Jim were simply going to peep in the window with the loose shutter to see if they could get a look at Boo Radley, and if I didn't want to go with them, I could go straight home and keep my fat flopping mouth shut, that was all. But why in the Sam Holy Hill did you wait till tonight? Because nobody could see them at night? Because Atticus would be deep in a book? Because if Boo Radley killed them, they'd miss school instead of vacation? And because it was easier to see inside a house at nighttime than in the daytime. Did I understand? Jim, please. Scout, I'm telling you, shut your trap or go home. I declare you're getting more like a girl every day. With that, I had no option but to join them. We thought it was best to go under the high wire fence at the rear of the Radley lot. The fence enclosed a large garden and a wooden outhouse. Jim held up the bottom wire and motioned Dill under it. I followed and held the wire for Jim. Don't make a sound, he whispered. Don't get in a row of collards, whatever you do. They'll wake the dead. With this thought in mind, I made perhaps 1 step per minute. We came to the gate that divided the garden from the backyard. Jim touched it. The gate squeaked. Spit on it, whispered Dill. We spat ourselves dry, and Jim opened the gate slowly. We were in the backyard. The back of the Radley house was even less inviting than the front. A ramshackle porch ran the width of the house. There were 2 doors and 2 dark windows. We crept to the house and around to the window with the hanging shutter. The sill was several inches taller than Jim. Give you a hand up, he whispered to Dill. Jim and I grabbed wrists and raised Dill. Hurry, Jim whispered. We can't last long. Dill punched my shoulder and we lowered him to the ground. What did you see? Nothing. Curtains. There's a little teeny light way off somewhere, though. Let's try the back window. Dill, no, I said. Dill let Jim go ahead to the back. When Jim put his foot on the bottom step of the porch, the steps squeaked. Jim skipped 2 steps, put his foot on the porch, heaved himself to it, and teetered a long moment. Dropping to his knees, he crawled to a window, raised his head, and looked in. Then I saw the shadow. It was the shadow of a man with a hat on. The back porch was now bathed in moonlight, and the shadow, crisp as toast, moved across the porch toward Jim. Dill saw it next. He put his hands to his face. When it crossed Jim, Jim saw it. He put his arms over his head and went rigid. The shadow stopped about a foot beyond Jim, then turned and moved back along the porch as it had come. Jim leaped off the porch and galloped toward us. He flung open the gate, danced Dill and me through, and shoved us between 2 rows of swishing collards. Halfway through the collards, I tripped. As I tripped, the roar of a shotgun shattered the neighborhood. Dill and Jim dived beside me. Jim's breath came in sobs. Fence by the schoolyard, Scout, hurry! Jim held the bottom wire. Dill and I rolled through, and we were halfway to the shelter of the schoolyard's solitary oak when we sensed that Jim was not with us. We ran back and found him struggling in the fence, kicking his pants off to get loose. He ran to the oak tree in his shorts. Safely behind it, Dill and I gave way to numbness. But Jim's mind was racing. We got to get home. They'll miss us. We ran across the schoolyard, crawled under the fence to the pasture behind our house, climbed our back fence, and rested at the back steps. Respiration normal, we strolled as casually as we could to the front yard. We looked down the street and saw a circle of neighbors at the Radley front gate. "We better go down there," said Jim. "They'll think it's funny if we don't show up." Mr. Nathan Radley was standing inside his gate, a shotgun across his arm. Atticus was standing beside Miss Maudie, Miss Stephanie Crawford, and Dill's aunt, Miss Rachel. We eased in beside Miss Maudie, who looked around. "Where were you all? Didn't you hear the commotion? Mr. Radley shot at a Negro in his collared patch." "Oh, did he hit him?" "No," said Miss Stephanie. "Shot in the air. Says he's got the other barrel waiting for the next sound he hears in that patch. And next time he won't aim high, be it a dog or—" "Jim Finch!" "Ma'am?" asked Jim. Atticus spoke. "Where are your pants, son?" "Pants, sir?" Mr. Finch." In the glare from the street light, I could see Dill hatching one. I won 'em from him," he said. "We were playing strip poker up yonder by the fish pool." Jim and I relaxed, but Miss Rachel went off like the town fire siren. "Dill Harris, gambling by my fish pool? I'll strip poker you, sir." Atticus saved Dill from immediate dismemberment. "Jim, Scout," said Atticus, "I don't want to hear of poker again. Go by Dill's and get your pants, Jim." As we trotted up the sidewalk, we heard Atticus's voice going on. "It's not serious. They all go through it, Miss Rachel." Dill was comforted, but Jim and I weren't. There was the problem of Jim's showing up in his pants the next morning. We came to Miss Rachel's steps and said goodbye to Dill, and he went inside. Then he evidently remembered he was engaged to me, for he ran back out and kissed me swiftly. "Y'all right here?" he bawled after us. Had Jim's pants been safely on him, I would not have slept much anyway. Every night sound I heard from my cot on the porch was magnified threefold. Every scratch of feet on gravel was Boo Radley seeking revenge. Insects splashing against the screen were his insane fingers picking the wire to pieces. I lingered between sleep and wakefulness until I heard Jim murmur, "Sleep, little Three Eyes?" "Are you crazy?" "Shh, Atticus's light's out." In the waning moonlight, I saw Jim swing his feet to the floor. "I'm going after him," he said. I sat upright. "You can't. I won't let you. Mr. Nathan's going to find him in the morning, Jim. When he shows him to Atticus, it'll be pretty bad, but that's all there is to it." "I know," said Jim. "That's why I'm going after him." I began to feel sick. "Look, Jim, a licking hurts, but it doesn't last. You'll get your head shot off. Please, Jim." It's like this, Scout," Jim said. "Atticus ain't ever whipped me since I can remember. I want to keep it that way." "You mean he's never caught you at anything?" "Maybe so, but I just want to keep it that way, Scout. We shouldn't have done that tonight, Scout." It was then, I suppose, that Jim and I first began to part company. I did not understand him. This was beyond me. I unlatched the back door and held it while he crept down the steps. The moon was setting and the lattice-work shadows were fading into fuzzy nothingness. Jim's white shirt tail dipped and bobbed like a small ghost dancing away. I waited until it was time to worry and listened for Mr. Radley's shotgun. Then I heard Atticus cough. I held my breath. Sometimes when we made a midnight pilgrimage to the bathroom, we would find him reading. He said he often woke up during the night, checked on us, and read himself back to sleep. His light stayed off this time, and I breathed again. The insects had retired, but ripe chinaberries drummed on the roof when the wind stirred, and the darkness was desolate with the barking of distant dogs. There Jim was, returning to me. His white shirt bobbed over the back fence. He came up the back steps, latched the door behind him, and sat on his cot. Wordlessly, He held up his pants. He lay down a while, and for a while I heard his cot trembling. Soon he was still. I did not hear him stir again. Jim stayed moody and silent for a week, so I left him alone and tried not to bother him. Then school started. The second grade was as bad as the first, only worse. They still flashed cards at you and wouldn't let you read or write. The only good thing was that this year I stayed as late as Jim, and we usually walked home together at 3 o'clock. One afternoon, as we were crossing the schoolyard towards home, Jim suddenly said, "There's something I didn't tell you." As this was his first complete sentence in several days, I encouraged him. "About what?" "About that night." Jim was silent. Then he said, "My britches, they were all in a tangle when I was getting out of them, but when I went back, they were folded across the fence. And something else." Jim took a deep breath. "They'd been sewed up. Not like a lady sewed them, but all crooked. It's almost like somebody knew you were coming back for them." Jim shuddered. "Like somebody was reading my mind, like somebody could tell what I was going to do." We were walking past our tree. In its knothole rested a ball of gray twine. "Jim," I said, "this is somebody's hiding place." "I don't think so, Scout. Let's wait 2 days. If it ain't gone, then we take it, okay?" "Okay." The twine was still there on the third day, and Jim pocketed it. From then on, we considered everything we found in the knothole our property.